Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Paul KUPIEC, and I'm an AEI resident scholar in financial services and the organizer of today's event. This afternoon, I'm pleased to host Matthew Fink to discuss his new biography of Carter Glass, one of the most influential politicians of his time and an architect of key legislation that shaped the American financial system. Carter Glass was born in 1858 in Lynchburg, Virginia, and grew up in the Reconstruction South. Glass's philosophy on the role of government was shaped by the views of Thomas Jefferson, a fellow Virginian born just 70 miles north in the Virginia Piedmont. From 1903 until the early 1940s, Carter Glass played a key role in every important financial legislative debate. His colleagues in the House and later in the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, recognized Glass as the go-to expert when it came to banking issues. Carter Glass was a consummate politician, meaning that he was an expert when it came to reading the political tea leaves and in crafting compromises that could be passed into law. Never an ideologue, he was willing to empower the federal government if, in his judgment, circumstances warranted. While not a Roosevelt progressive, he shepherded the most important progressive New Deal reforms through the Senate. Carter Glass had his faults. He could be grumpy, but mostly in private. He was not a proponent of racial equality, and that's putting it mildly. And he was a Democrat. That was a joke. But times were different then, and his conservative approach towards government and legislation would probably be out of place in today's Democratic Party. After serving more than 35 years in the House, as Secretary of Treasury, and in the Senate, he sat for an interview with the Tulsa Tribune. In the interview, Glass is quoted as saying, "I have acted in the way I felt I should, and let the people decide for themselves if they approved of my actions. I have never considered what effect my actions would have upon the continuance of my public career. I've done what I thought was best for the country." We could sure make use of some more politicians that acted like that today. In his new Carter Glass biography, Matthew Fink does a tremendous job of recounting the life, times, and accomplishments of this outstanding and colorful statesman. In the end, I came to believe that Carter Glass's Tulsa Tribune quote rang true. I am now happy to introduce our featured author, Matthew Fink. Before he became a celebrated author, Matthew Fink worked at the Investment Company Institute, the National Association of the Mutual Fund Industry. He not only worked there from 1971 to 2004, he was the president of the institution from 1991 to 2004. He is the director of the Oppenheimer Mutual Funds, a member of FINRA Investment Companies Committee, and a director of the Retirement Income Industry Association. He's authored several articles on mutual fund history, and his History of Mutual Funds, The Rise of Mutual Funds, An Insider's View, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, was such a success it went on to a second edition and was updated to cover the 2008 financial crisis. Matt is an honor graduate of Brown University and Harvard Law School, and, like Mick Jagger, he also attended the London School of Economics. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Fink. Careful with the steps.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks for having me. I see friends from all parts of my life here. It's amazing. I started the book on Glass because I kept running into him in my career. When I joined the Investment Company Institute, which represents mutual funds, I found they were regulated by the SEC. And I asked everybody at the SEC and at the ICI, where did the SEC come from? And everybody said, oh, it was a Roosevelt New Deal reform agency. I did a little research. That's dead wrong. Roosevelt opposed creation of the SEC. It was Carter Glass who got it. And that, so on and so forth with other laws that Glass did. So I was interested in Glass. So about 6 years ago, I started doing a little research and reading. And I found it was much more interesting than just the things he had done, because there's a paradox about Glass, and that's why my book is entitled The Unlikely Reformer. Because generally, Glass was a racist and highly conservative, in fact, very reactionary. He made his fame in Virginia turn of the 19th century, getting the Virginia Constitution amended to deprive 95% of black residents the vote. It was a very hard thing to do, and he did it. And he stayed that way his whole life. He's very conservative. He was the leading Democratic opponent of the New Deal. He had an 80% anti-New Deal voting record. And there he was, a Democrat voting against the New Deal. In his personal life, as Paul alluded to, he also was a reactionary, hated the modern age. He was the perfect curmudgeon or stuffy old man or whatever, the angry old man, grumpy old man. He grew up with horses, and when automobiles came, he wanted to get rid of them and go back to horses. When he was elected to the Senate had a telephone system where you call the operator and gave the operator the number, and it switched to dial phones. He insisted that it go back to operators, and the Senate agreed with him, so went back. He was from Lynchburg, Virginia, went there on the weekends, but during the week he lived at the Mayflower Hotel, not far from here. He lived there for 25 years. He came in one Monday and found the lobby had been remodeled, and he quit the Mayflower. So Glass was a total reactionary. That's one side of Glass, racist, reactionary, curmudgeon. The other half, Glass, he was the author of three of the most important and progressive financial laws in U.S. history: the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Glass-Stegall Act of 1933, and portions of the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 that created the SEC. So that is the paradox. I can now give you the conclusion, because I spent a lot of time researching and thinking and writing. The 3 points to remember about Glass. I should do these at the end, but I want to give them at the beginning, make it easy. Number one, he generally opposed any federal action. Number two, he made an exception where the action would curb Wall Street. 3, he did not believe the way to address Wall Street was through regulation, because he, like Brandeis and others, thought regulation never worked. It always failed. So instead, he believed in breaking up concentrations of financial and political power. Those are the 3 main points, I think, to know about Glass. Now, we'll give a summary of the book. Glass was born in 1858, just before the Civil War, in Lynchburg, Virginia, a very southern city. His family was wiped out by the Civil War and Reconstruction. He had to quit school at age 14, so he was largely self-educated. He read Shakespeare, the English poets, the ancient Greeks. Like Lincoln, he was very self-educated and very well-educated. At age 14, he started selling newspapers on the corner. He then became a printer's assistant called a printer's devil, then a reporter for the paper, then the editor of the paper, then the editor. And when the owner wanted to sell it, he arranged for Glass loans so Glass could buy it. That's how much Glass was thought of. Given the state of Virginia and the South after the Civil War, Glass did very well. Very successful businessman in the context of Reconstruction, post-Civil War, devastated South. So like a lot of successful business people, he went into politics. And there was only one party to join, the Democratic Party. He was a loyal Democrat. Joined the Democratic Party, and as I said earlier, he made his fame as a Virginia Senate, member of the Virginia Senate, and coming up with a way to amend the Virginia Constitution to deprive almost all blacks in Virginia of the right to vote. That made him a hero to white Virginia. So in 1902, he was elected to the United States Congress. Glass comes into Congress at a time when the Republicans dominate the federal government, and they've done largely since the Civil War. Both houses were strongly Republican. Teddy Roosevelt was in the White House, etc. And a young, not so young, a Democrat like Glass, who nobody ever heard of, is very much of a non-entity. He'd like to go on the Foreign Relations Committee, which is interesting to him, but instead they stick him on the Banking Committee, which is a real backwater. If I'm right, there had not been a major banking bill since the National Banking Act passed during the Civil War. So Glass is sent to a complete no man's land, but being a very bright, studious, and energetic guy, Glass spends years reading everything he can find his hands on about banking and finance. So he becomes an expert. Whether anybody knows that, I don't know, but Glass really reads everything. At that time, beginning of the 20th century, The United States was the only major industrial country that did not have a central bank to manage the currency and fight panics. Nobody thought about it very much. There were a few professors and reformers who said, gee, we ought to have a national bank. But things were going along pretty well. The Republicans who controlled the government weren't too interested. Teddy Roosevelt found banking very boring, and I think he's right. So nobody paid much attention. Then we have a major panic in 1907, the biggest financial crisis until 1929. Banks and trust companies in New York fail left and right. Insurance companies are threatened. Brokerage firms are about to go down. The New York Stock Exchange is about to close. And there is no federal or state authority to address the panic. It is addressed by an individual, J.P. Morgan, who controlled an investment banking firm, J.P. Morgan and Company. And Morgan goes around to his buddies at other securities firms, other banking firms, and the U.S. Treasury, and puts together rescue packages on a voluntary basis, bails out a series of financial institutions. And phew, we get through the panic of 1907, there's a bad depression, and now people in Washington say, gee, maybe we do need a central bank. You know, we haven't had one, and this crisis shows, and Morgan's not going to be here forever. So the Republicans, who are in firm control, named the most powerful Republican senator, not on the Senate Banking Committee, but the most powerful by far Republican senator, Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. Very powerful guy. I can't think of a comparable person today, but maybe like a Lyndon Johnson, or a very strong guy. And he is to develop the Republican version of a central bank. He goes, consults, they forms a committee, hires experts, they go all over the U.S., they go all over Europe, they meet with the English central bankers, the German central bankers, the French central bankers, take a long time at it. As you read about it, it looks like they thought they had forever to come up with something, because they've been in power since the Civil War and probably thought they were going to be in power for the next 100 years. So there was no rush. 1911, Aldrich releases his plan, and it calls for a national bank, a very powerful national bank, single bank, probably to be located in New York, and it is to be run by private bankers, owned and run by private banks. It is a typical conservative, old-fashioned, good old Republican bank. I think if he had put it forth in 1908 or 1909 or 1910, Aldrich would have been the hero and got enactment of the bank, but he waited too long. Missed an opportunity because there was a rise of progressivism and populism in the country. The Democrats take the House in November of 1910, if my dates are right. So 1911, the bill comes out, and the Democrats and liberal Republicans have no interest in it, and the Aldrich plan, this pinnacle of central banking, just dies. The Democrats are now in control. The Democrats have to name somebody to come up with their version of a bill, and Glass is the only guy probably in the whole Congress who knows anything about banking. So they pick Glass to draft the Democratic version of a central bank. And Glass comes up with something that very few people had ever thought about, but he comes up to it pretty quickly. He does not want a single central bank in New York. He wants several reserve banks, 15, 20, in different cities around the country, so that those reserve banks will help the local banks, who will help the local economy, the local farmers and merchants. It's a big country. We don't want all the money being run and going to New York. So he wants a diversified, decentralized system. That's what Glass's he calls for. Now, Wilson gets elected president. When Glass comes up with this before we know who the president's going to be in 1912. Do you remember there's a famous three-way election? William Howard Taft, the then president, Republican, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and Teddy Roosevelt comes back in the new Progressive Party. So when Glass comes out with this plan for a decentralized reserve system, he doesn't even know who the next president's going to be. Turns out it's Wilson. So he goes and meets with Wilson, and they love each other. They never met before, but they're both Virginians. They're both racists. They both don't like a powerful federal government. They're Jeffersonians, but yet reformers. They're in this funny kind of bind. And Wilson loves Glass's plan. It's right up his alley. Over time, he makes two changes to it. Makes more than two, but the two big ones are, Glass had these reserve banks, and over them he would put the control of the currency just to make sure they were coordinated to some degree. Wilson says, gee, the controller's too busy doing other stuff, running supervising national banks. Why don't we create a board, an altruistic board of good people who will oversee this system, the Federal Reserve Board. And also the governors of the Federal Reserve Board. Glass proposes that most will be chosen by the president and approved by the Senate, but a few will be picked by the private bankers. And Wilson and his aide Brandeis says, no private bank control. It's only going to be chosen by the president. So that is the Federal Reserve Act that Glass comes out with. It walks into a giant political tangle or tangles of monumental proportions. First of all, the Republicans hate it because they want a strong central bank a la the Aldrich plan. And this is some screwy Democratic populist with hay coming out of his ears coming up with this decentralized system. Secondly, the radical Democrats from the Midwest largely, La Follette and so on, don't want any kind of bank. They think all banks are evil, and that's why you see the cover of my book has a cartoon they used. And so Glass is hit from both the left and the right. Plus, everybody wants to get into the act. Secretary of the Treasury McAdoo wants to get into it. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan wants to get into it. Brandeis, Wilson's advisor, wants to get into it. And Glass find themselves negotiating with, forgetting the bankers, the big city bankers, the small country bankers. And so Glass has to balance 100 interests, make 100 compromises. But lo and behold, Glass gets the bill through his House, the House of Representatives, and then when it goes to the Senate, Glass is the guy who gets it through the Senate. So we end up in 1913, I think Christmas Day, Wilson signing the Federal Reserve Act using the decentralized system that Glass came up with. And as I said, this is the first illustration of Glass not liking regulation, liking fragmentation. He doesn't want one powerful central bank. He wants a series. We end up with 12 regional reserve banks. Glass now, nobody heard him a year before, he's now a national figure, at least for people, the few people who care about this stuff. Wilson names him Secretary of the Treasury. A Virginia senator dies, and the governor names Glass to a stub seat for the U.S. Senate. And Glass proceeds to get elected 4 more times to the U.S. Senate. So Glass is now a senator of great accomplishment, and great people think a lot of him. We're now in the 1920s, the late 20s. We have a roaring stock market, fueled largely by people buying securities on margin. There were no federal or state limits on how much a bank could lend you, and typically people bought stock with 20% down. You could buy $10,000 of securities with $2,000. This works terrifically when the market's going up like it does in 27, 28, and 29. It's terrific leverage on the upside. And Glass, a member of the Banking Committee now, Senate Banking Committee, minority member, looks at things and sees what Galbraith later refers to as a river of gold pouring to Wall Street. Because the banks around the country, the banks in Lynchburg, the banks in Wichita, Kansas, the banks in Sacramento, California, are not lending to local merchants and farmers where they could earn 5%. They're lending to banks in New York, Citibank, Chase Manhattan Bank, because they can get 8%. And Chase Manhattan, Citibank, in turn, lend that money to Merrill Lynch, who lends it to my wife's grandfather and my uncle for margin loans. So the money is pouring across the country with local banks using their deposits and other funds to lend to the New York brokers market, in effect. Glass is outraged. He digs a little deeper, and it gets worse, what he finds. These 12 reserve banks are lending to the banks in their areas, to lend to the New York City banks, to lend to Merrill Lynch, to lend to the customers. The reserve banks are buying the paper, the loan paper, that the commercial banks in these different cities have lent. So the reserve banks are funding this huge flow of money to Wall Street. In other words, the system Glass created to decentralize things and have local economies supported is now being used as mechanisms to get money from the countryside to Wall Street. And Glass is outraged. He gets on the floor of the Senate, he writes editorials, And above all, he goes to the Federal Reserve Board, which he had created, and says, this is outrageous. It's not why this system got created. I was the creator. You guys have power. Stop it. And the Fed says, well, we'll think about it. Good point, think about it. Basically does nothing. And Glass gets more and more outraged, and Glass becomes a real stick in the side, if that whatever the expression is, to the Fed and the banking industry, because Glass is almost out there alone screaming that this awful thing is happening. So they get a professor at Princeton, Joseph Stagg Lawrence, to write a book called Wall Street and Washington, published in May of 1929, saying the stock market is terrific, very efficient. It's great that this money's going there. It's really making a great economy. And this idiot Glass, this country boy, barely wears shoes, doesn't believe in creation or what, Darwin, idiot. And that publishes in May of 29. To add insult to injury, Princeton, of course, is the home of Glass's hero, Woodrow Wilson. So Glass really gets dissed here. Well, we all know what happens next. A couple of months later, October, huge stock market crash. My wife's grandfather and my uncle all get wiped out with these brokers' loans. People across the country, allegedly people in New York, are diving out of skyscrapers, and all this is happening. And people say, by God, that idiot Glass was right again. He predicted this. The Senate is still controlled very lopsidedly by Republicans. This is 1929. And guess who they pick to run a subcommittee to look into this and come up with legislation so it won't happen again? The Democrat Glass. I don't know if this has ever happened in American history, but here's a case where one party selects somebody very deeply in the other party to head a very important subcommittee. So Glass now has a subcommittee that is going to develop what we know as the Glass-Stegall Act. Got to remember, we know it for other reasons, but Glass's main goal is to prevent the Federal Reserve banks from lending for speculation and to limit how much commercial banks can lend for speculation. And he gets those provisions in the first draft of his bill, and probably at that point, Glass was ready to go home and to get it through both houses, and that's his main concern. But two other things happen, which we know about now, looking back, that kind of overshadow that. One is, first is federal insurance of deposits. In the late 20s and early 30s, 5,000 or 6,000 banks fail around the country. They're mostly in rural agricultural states, wheat states in the Midwest, cotton states in the South. Local banks are lending to farmers. We have a big agriculture depression, so those banks fail left and right. And there's a public outcry for the federal government to insure deposits, both from depositors who got wiped out, also from local communities. There's no source of money in these communities anymore, and also from small bankers. And they all demand federal deposit insurance. Everybody in the country who has more than a high school degree at that time thinks federal deposit insurance is the worst idea ever. President Hoover, Governor Franklin Roosevelt of New York, Glass, people on the Federal Reserve Board, people who head the big banks, because they think it's a crazy system to have all the powerful, well-run banks in the country pay premiums every year to shore up badly managed small banks that ought to go out of business. But there's a tidal wave of, and the depression gets worse and worse, tidal wave of public demand for deposit insurance. Glass hates the idea, but he learns that unless he puts it in his bill, he will not get his bill that will restrict lending for speculation. So Glass reluctantly puts deposit insurance in his bill. The third area, the other one that comes up that we all think about Glass-Stegall, it's not anything anybody thinks of very much at the beginning, and that's banks being in the securities business. This gets a little technical, but let me just say this. At the beginning of the 20th century, large commercial banks, mostly in New York, largely Citibank, First National City, I think it was called then, want to get into securities underwriting and dealing. But their lawyers, Sherman and Sterling and the other downtown law firms, look at the law, the National Banking Act passed in the Civil War, that says what national banks can do, and it doesn't say you can do securities. So they can't do it. But they're smart lawyers, so they come up with, let's create a sister company called a securities affiliate. It can do securities, and we can tie it to the banks in two ways. It can have the same officers and directors as the bank, and secondly, the certificate for 300 shares of Citibank or Chase Manhattan will also add to that certificate 300 shares of Citibank Securities Affiliate. And if you turn in your certificate now, you'll get your new certificate evidencing ownership of both the bank and the securities affiliate. So securities affiliates become a big thing in the 20s using this device. In fact, they become the biggest securities firms in the country. In 1929, the largest securities firm was Citibank Securities Affiliate. And whereas Citibank, as a bank then, could only operate in New York State, because we did not have cross-state banking in those days, but the securities affiliate's in 50 states, and it goes gangbusters, and it's headed by a terrific salesman, Charlie Mitchell. And so it's a big deal. And the question comes up, what to do about these security affiliates? Glass's first bill says they ought to be regulated. National banks, affiliates of national banks ought to be regulated by the control of the currency. Security affiliates of state banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System should be regulated by the Federal Reserve Board. And Glass doesn't focus too much on it. But his next bill, a year or so later, moves way beyond regulation to calling for the abolition of security affiliates. And I thought I would do years of research and find what made Glass move. And I have a dozen things, but I'm not sure which, so I'll just tick them off. First of all, Glass was around in 1913. That's when he was appointed to run this subcommittee that he drafted the Federal Reserve Act. Same time, the Democrats in Congress created another committee called the PUJO Committee to look into the money trust, and it came out with a bunch of recommendations. One was to outlaw security affiliates. So Glass obviously remembered that when they looked at this 20 years before, they dealt with securities affiliates by outlawing them. Second, Glass's first proposal is to have the Fed and the controller regulate securities affiliates, but Glass does not have much faith in regulation because he just came through a period where he yelled and met and screamed at the Fed to do something about speculation, and the Fed blew him off. So Glass is not exactly enamored with regulation. Third, when Glass held his hearings, the Federal Reserve Board testified before them, and Glass said, Mr. Chairman or whatever, Mr. Governor, what do you think we ought to do about security affiliates? And he got an answer that is something like this. You know, they are a problem. If we could do it all over again, we wouldn't have them, but it's going to be very hard to unscramble the omelet. But yet if you want to, here's a piece of paper that has legislative language to abolish them, if that's what you want to do. He gets this mealy-mouthed, but I think underneath negative by the Fed itself, indicating it doesn't have much faith in regulation. So Glass is probably teetering at this point, but then two things happen, as they often do in life, that push it way over the line. Right as Glass is having his hearings, a major New York bank, Bank of United States, fails. It is not one of the big, well-known banks. It is a bank for immigrants in the garment business, and it fails spectacularly, leaving tens of thousands of New Yorkers without any deposits, wiped out. It's run by two semi-crooks, and it has 59 affiliates, mostly real estate, not security affiliates. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the hearings, to think of what to do about security affiliates, this gigantic institution fails in the biggest city in the country with a bunch of affiliates. And the second thing happens in response to that, the New York State Superintendent of Banking, Joseph Broderick, introduces legislation in the New York legislature to prohibit New York chartered banks, New York State chartered banks, from having security affiliates. Now Glass is not just a theory, it's not just the PUJO committee 20 years before. Now there's legislation in the most important financial state in the union calling for abolishing security affiliates. So I think these reasons cumulatively are why Glass moves to separation, abolishment, rather than regulation. So that is the Glass-Stegall Act, limits or prohibitions on lending for speculation, federal insurance of deposits, and making it clear that banks, not only can banks themselves not be in securities business, but they also can't have affiliates that are in the securities business. Roosevelt, Glass, the same way Glass handed a draft of the Federal Reserve Act to Wilson. President Roosevelt gets elected, Franklin Roosevelt gets elected, and Glass hands him this Glass-Stegall Act. Not fully done, but mostly done. and it's a present to Roosevelt, and it gets enacted in the first 100 days of the New Deal. I think what's reflected here to some degree, again, is Glass's idea that regulation is not the way to address financial problems. Fragmentation, decentralization is, so that rather than try to regulate bank securities affiliates, abolish them, separate banks and securities firms. There's one more act I want to discuss just to fill the story, and that's the next year's Securities Exchange Act of 1934, creating the SEC. Way back in the Peugeot Committee in 1913, two other reforms it recommended. One was to require somebody issuing new securities to give disclosure to the public, and the second was to regulate the New York Stock Exchange and brokers. And guess who they had as the regulatory authority? You will never guess this. The Post Office Department, because they're very concerned about federal jurisdiction, and the Constitution gives, I guess, the federal government the right to regulate the mails. So here's an easy way to regulate. Nothing happens to those recommendations. 20 years later, Roosevelt gets elected, the New Deal comes in, and they turn to securities regulation. First, they do the Securities Act of 33 requiring disclosure, and they debate who jurisdiction should go to, and the Roosevelt people select the Federal Trade Commission. It was an agency created in the Wilson administration, and it is jam-packed with liberal reformers from the Wilson, probably stayed there since Wilson, or maybe there's some new ones, but that's what they pick. Now we get to 34, and they now take up the harder issue of stock exchange and broker regulation. And the new dealers come out very much, and they say, here's what we want to regulate the stock exchange and stockbroker dealers, and we're going to use the same agency, the Federal Trade Commission. The New York Stock Exchange then was much more powerful than we can imagine today. It was the dominant American financial institution. It was not just a symbol, it was very powerful economically, politically, socially, and the New York Stock Exchange goes crazy over this proposal to have a bunch of liberals at the Federal Trade Commission regulate the holy New York Stock Exchange. They go nuts, and there's a very bitter fight between the new dealers, who have a bill that would give jurisdiction to the Federal Trade Commission, and also, I should add, give margin authority to the Federal Reserve Board, to have margin standards. They go crazy. Glass has not shown much interest in this area, but he now steps in, and he proposes to create a new agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and to provide it with authority to deal with margin. Glass does this for two reasons. One is he does not like a large agency doing many things. He wants a specialized securities agency rather than the FTC that does 20 other things. Another example of his fragmentation approach. Secondly, he doesn't want the Fed having anything to do with the stock market. He doesn't want the Fed doing margin. So he puts in a bill to have a new agency, the SEC, which will regulate the stock exchange, brokers, and also do margin. Roosevelt and his aides violently oppose it, and there's a showdown vote in the Senate Banking Committee. And remember, this is 1934, the height of Roosevelt and New Deal powers, and Glass beats Roosevelt 10-8 in the Senate Banking Committee. They vote to create a new agency, the SEC. Along the way, they drop the margin thing, so margin goes to the Fed. But Glass amazingly beats Roosevelt at the height of the New Deal. So instead of having securities regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, we get a new agency, SEC, thanks to Glass. I just want to wrap up about it. I'm probably at 50 minutes now or something. I don't know where I am. I want to say three things. So we have these three laws, Federal Reserve Act, Glass-Stegall Act, Securities and Exchange Act. They all obviously have been amended over time, and I'll go into a little detail on that, but they largely are in place today. What's amazing is not that they've been changed over time as people been different events and different theories, but they're largely in place today. The Federal Reserve Act was amended in 1935 to give the Federal Reserve Board more power than the 12 reserve banks. And so there's a movement to have it be a real central bank, not a decentralized system, but it still is decentralized. For example, the Open Market Committee, which is the big committee deciding on interest rates, has 7 people from the Federal Reserve Board and 5 people from the regional banks. So it still is a decentralized system, not as much as Glass first had, but still that way. The Securities and Exchange Act provided for the SEC. Every year since I've been around, any administration, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, the first they come up with, the SEC has to be rolled up into a larger agency. Maybe we'll merge it with the Commodity Future Trading Commission. Maybe we'll merge 6 of them together. There are 12 agencies. There are too many. There have been 100 proposals. None of them ever got anywhere. The SEC is still a small, for good or bad, is still a small, specialized securities agency just like Glass wanted. Third, the biggest changes in the Glass-Stegall Act were the Fed, by rulings, and then Congress in 1999 got rid of the prohibition on securities affiliates. So officially, 1999, Congress blessed the Fed's attempts, and so banks were permitted to get back in the securities business through securities affiliates. But all the other provisions of the Glass-Stegall Act are in place. Banks are limited how much they can lend for speculation. Federal Reserve banks can't lend to banks for speculation. Securities firms can't take deposits. We still have federal deposit insurance. So most of Glass-Stegall remains. So it's kind of interesting that the structure today is largely, not fully, but what Glass first came down with. I'd like to make 3 last comments. One is Glass's approach favoring decentralization or fragmentation, whatever we want to call it, was not unique to Glass. If you go back and read Brandeis, that's what Brandeis was talking about. When he wrote about big business and the antitrust laws, he was not calling on that to give lower prices for consumers. He did not like bigness in government, in business, or any place else. Frankfurter followed Brandeis. So a lot of people, in addition, but Glass was the guy who got it done. These guys gave speeches, wrote opinions, but Glass got 3 laws enacted that reflect it. Second, since the Second World War, we've really abandoned this approach, and we've gone to a regulation approach, more and more, imposing more and more regulation. The high point was the Dodd-Frank Act, which came after the 2008 financial crisis, which is a regulator's dream. The act is 848 pages. It requires regulators to adopt 243 new rules, to undertake 67 major studies, and prepare 22 reports. So if you like regulation, this is what you ought to order off the menu. Third, despite this, there is a widespread belief that Dodd-Frank is not going to stop us having another financial crisis. My book is full of quotes from people all over the map saying that, but Neil Barofsky, former Special Inspector General of the Treasury, said, quote, "We had a system that was broken, and the fundamentals haven't changed. The question is not if the U.S. faces another financial disaster, it's when." On top of this, for whatever reason, policy or just the economy, we have fewer banks with more deposits, more concentration. So today, you've seen recently, in the last couple of years, politicians like John McCain, Sanders, Warren, calling for restoration of Glass-Stegall. Some people have called for stronger stuff, not just separate banks and securities firms, separate banks from asset managers, mutual fund managers, pension managers, and finally just impose a limit on the size of banks. For example, no bank can have more than 3% of U.S. deposits. The last thing I will say is this issue has kind of gone dormant, but I have no doubt we'll hear more about it as these 28 candidates, whatever it is, keep jabbering away. And if there ever is a financial crisis of any sort, this is going to come out of the medicine cabinet. So the last thing I will say, all the issues Glass dealt with are still with us today. And I think it was Faulkner, another Southerner like Glass, who said, "The past is never dead. It's not even the past." Thank you.
Like his classmate Mick Jagger, it's a hard act to follow, right? So we do have 2 expert discussants today. We're lucky to have that. Speaking in alphabetical order will be Wayne Abernathy. First, Wayne joined the American Bankers Association in February 2005 and serves as the Executive Vice President for Financial Institutions, Policy, and Regulatory Affairs. Before joining the ABA, Mr. Abernathy served 2 years as Treasury Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions under President George W. Bush and received the Alexander Hamilton Award in recognition for his service. Prior to his work in the Treasury, Mr. Abernathy served as the staff director of the Senate Banking Committee under Senator Phil Gramm, who was one of the authors of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which undid the Glass-Stegall Act in part. He earned a master's degree down the street at the International Studies and School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Speaking second after Mr. Abernathy is Art Wilmarth, who is a professor of law at George Washington University. He joined the faculty there in 1986 after 11 years in private law practice, including as a partner at Jones Day. He's the author of more than 40 law review articles and book chapters in the fields of banking law and American constitutional history, and he's the co-editor of a book on the financial crisis of 2008. In 2005, the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers awarded him a prize for the best law review article. I could go on, but I won't. You can read about it online. He's testified before U.S. Congress many times. He was a consultant to the Financial Inquiry Commission that looked into the financial crisis. He has a BA from Yale University and his law degree from Harvard Law School. So both of our experts here, thank you for coming. And Wayne, the mic is yours.
It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thanks for everybody coming. This is an important issue because it's a very important book. Besides that, it's a good book. It's a fun book. It's an interesting book to read, which is unusual for books. You'd say, I want to read a book about somebody who was involved in financial legislation. And you go, oh yeah, let me know how that goes. But it's actually a very interesting book and an enjoyable book. And this biography is so enjoyable because unlike many biographies of financial folks or others, it doesn't paint a two-dimensional person. It presents Carter Glass in a very three-dimensional way, which I think also makes it very difficult to pin a label on him. He's a very interesting person and a very multi-dimensional person. The second reason why this book is, I think, very interesting is because it is a great study in the legislative process. You can learn a lot about how to make laws by looking at the way that Carter Glass was involved with it. And it supports my own conclusion that based upon watching the financial system up very close, that it's hard, you got to really work at it, to make financial legislation partisan. It naturally tends toward bipartisanship. And even when Glass and others tried to go forward with a Democrat approach, or the Republicans tried their approach, in the end you ended up with legislation that was strongly bipartisan in each of the significant pieces that he was involved with. And the third reason why I'd say this book is so very interesting and very readable, Carter Glass was deeply involved in many significant pieces of financial legislation, in some ways for a very important reason. He was willing to be involved, which reminds me of the senator I worked for, Senator Phil Gramm, who is known to have said, in Washington, if you're willing to take on the tough issues, people will stand aside and push you to the front. And that was the case with Glass. He would take on the tough things because nobody else wanted to get involved with those. Ah, yeah, you go do that tough thing. Now, if I could, I'll add a fourth point. This book relies on how this, and it's a fourth point that isn't fully within the book because it relies upon what happens in the years afterwards, but which Matt talked about. And that's despite Carter Glass's policy intentions and hard work, things did not turn out quite the way he envisioned or wanted. And that's a lesson well to be learned by all who would be involved in policy making in a great and grand republic. Much of the story comes together in the Depression. Perhaps it's the climax of the plot of the book, if you will. The Depression was a real-world dystopia. The dystopia was a market recession intensified and prolonged by the search for utopia or application of utopian ideas. The foundation was the assertion that government planners were smarter than the markets. Yet they were ignoring how what they were doing and what they were planning to do was stifling the market recovery and making sure that what would have been a steep recession and a quick recovery prolonged for a decade. Carter Glass played an unwitting, though well-intentioned role in that. From what is told in this biography, Glass was not venal. He sought to legislate in accordance with sincere beliefs, with a desire to solve what he saw as real problems. To do that, he enlisted the successful legislator's gift of knowing when and how to make a compromise that brought people together enough to pass legislation, surrendering some details, however prized they might have been, accepting others that might not have been favored, but they weren't showstoppers. And he did this to achieve his overall purpose of what he was trying to accomplish in the legislation. As Matt points out in the book and notes in the book, quote, Glass combined technical mastery of complex banking issues, political acumen, and fierce determination to achieve a series of legislative victories in the financial arena. And that is very true. He understood the job and the process of legislating, which is becoming a dying art, at least in the Congress as it has been, I'd say, in the last 10 years or so. And that's, again, based upon having worked there a long time and seen it operate differently. Legislatures are based on the recognition that no one person knows it all, and that multiple viewpoints have to be brought together and accommodated to some degree if you're ever going to pass anything. And Matt Fink does an excellent job of showing how, as a master legislator, Glass brought forward the Federal Reserve Act, the Glass-Stegall Act, and the Securities and Exchange Act. I want to turn at this point to Congressman Glass's work of 100 years ago, 100 and a few, and that led to the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act derived its natal energy, as was talked about, from the financial panic of 1907. An early proposal was led by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, as Matt pointed out, and Congressman Edward Vreeland of New York. Yankees all, which only fed the disquiet of the Virginia congressman at the time, Congressman Carter Glass. As Matt Fink relates, the Aldrich-Vreeland Emergency Currency Act became the subject of the first policy speech that Carter Glass gave on the floor of the House. Because the law, or the proposed law, focused on what was then called currency elasticity, but it only focused on coming up with solutions in the time of emergencies. Glass felt it needed to be more available, and he compared the bill to Milton's Paradise Lost. Quote, that matchless epic poem which everybody praises and nobody reads. He was sure that was true of their legislation. I think that's true, frankly, of the Glass-Stegall Act when he put it forward. And in a bit of foreshadowing, I would note that it was insightful that not only was it applied to the Glass-Stegall Act, but it's a characterization applied to many who would invoke that totem in today's discussions as well. When I hear calls for a 21st century Glass-Stegall Act, I rarely hear anybody who understands, in fact, what the Glass-Stegall Act did, how it would functionally apply in the modern economy, and what problems it would actually solve. The 1912 election brought together, as was mentioned, Virginians Wilson and Glass to bring about the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. That act did more and less than Glass wanted, but it had the essential structure that was discussed about creating something that you don't find anywhere else in the world, a monetary authority based on a decentralized structure, what turned out to be 12 regional banks. And that's a structure that, to some degree, continues today. Glass was nervous about the idea of placing power in the hands of what he was sure would be the New York financial interests or the central powers of Washington. And so that's why we have the 12 and why he promoted that. Now, how much of that has remained, we can look at that at another time. I think not as much as one would think, but now let's move 20 years later. Where the U.S. economy is mired in a deepening depression, a very different experience from the panic of 1907. Matt Fink recalls the words of Carter Glass expressing his hope for the Federal Reserve at the time of its creation. And this is what he said. In the first legislation, Glass sought for a careful, quote, a careful revision and a wise reformation of the entire banking and currency system of the United States, whereby panics may be prevented, or if not prevented, under which their violence may be diminished, and the evils consequently greatly abated. To what extent were these wishes of Carter Glass fulfilled 20 years later? I fear that we must say that, however well-intentioned, they were wholly unfulfilled. Panic was not prevented, its violence not diminished, but instead stimulated, and the evils, rather than abated, were prolonged. Moreover, a strong case has been made that this was because, rather than in spite of, the Federal Reserve. The tragedy is that then Senator Glass at that time did not examine or re-examine what he had wrought and how to address its flaws. He did not consider how application of the popular monetary doctrine of the day was starving the economy of liquidity, probably because he subscribed to the doctrine. I referred to what was called the real bills doctrine, which was a highly pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical doctrine. The worse things got, the more the Fed pulled money out of the system. And it continued to reinforce things. So it just made things worse and worse, while the Federal Reserve governors are thinking, why isn't this working? We're doing everything we should, and all of the indicators of monetary policy indicate everything's going as it's supposed to. And yet they were making things worse all the time. When the economy was in decline, the Fed effectively reduced the supply of money and continued doing that throughout the decade. So the tragedy, and again I say tragedy, is that Glass did nothing to review the Fed's horrendously wrong monetary policies. Glass devoted his energies and skills to slay the mythical dragon of banks having securities affiliates. With Glass, it was visceral. Glass more than believed in that problem. He felt that the 1929 stock market crash, at its core, was caused by bank-owned securities affiliates. He felt no need to find supporting data. His attention was turned away from the Fed's monetary policies. Glass's formidable legislative skill helped produce the Glass-Stegall Act, among which the provisions, as we've been told, would ban banks from being involved with securities firms. Now I'd like to turn to another book. This book here, it's called The Separation of Commercial and Investment Banking. This is just about the most boring book I have ever read. And you really got to strain through it and read it in doses. This was written by George J. Benston. Benston, he's the author, was an associate dean and a professor at Emory University. And he combed through the legislative record behind the Glass-Stegall Act, looking for the factual basis on which that provision of separating banking from securities affiliates was based. And he found nothing. There was no factual basis for it. There were people quoting one another, and they were quoting and sharing each other's opinions, but they didn't look at the data. And that's probably why, after 5 years after the passage of the Glass-Stegall Act, as Benson notes, it did not restore public confidence in the securities market and in the economy. Economic activity remained depressed until 1941 or 1942, and securities underwriting and trades did not reach pre-depression levels until the 1950s. In particular, Benston searched for the factual support, as I mentioned, and this was his conclusion after going through the entire record, working hard through it. Quote, the evidence from the Glass-Stegall period, from the pre-Glass-Stegall period, that was the evidence of the depression before the act was passed, is totally inconsistent with the belief that banks' securities activities or investments caused them to fail or caused the financial system to collapse. Those who claim otherwise either misread the record, did not look at the actual data, or simply uncritically believed unsupported assertions made by senators and their staff. So let me sum up with maybe the lesson we might learn from all of that, is that in the following 60 plus years, much of what had been put in place, the markets eroded and ended up taken away when the law that I was involved with that passed in 1999, it did nothing new. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act put into statute what the regulators had already created to keep up with what the markets were already doing, which was to expand the number of bank involvement and others in the financial and securities markets, because customers, they didn't want to shop amongst different things. They wanted to be able to do a lot of stuff at the same place. But the point is, as Matt Fink again points out in his biography, and remember this is a biography, it's about a person, and it's very much a good read if you want to see how humans are involved over a long period of time dealing with financial problems. And they'll do their very best, and when they work together, maybe you get better results. But in the end, maybe the important lesson is that's what's needed for these policymakers is a certain dose of humility, because time, the markets, and others may very much change what it is you sought out to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Paul for inviting me to join in this discussion. Thank you to Matt for a wonderful book, a great read, and certainly the issues I think that Matt discusses in the book and the issues that Carter Glass dealt with are very much still relevant to us today. I very much agree with Wayne that this is a very good read. I like the fact that it's a political history. Glass was dealing, obviously, with very difficult economic and financial issues, but I think that what's great about Matt's book is that it gives you the political background, it gives you the personal background, that his own personal biography, I think, explains a great deal about the perspective that he brought to these issues. Matt mentioned the very interesting parallels between Glass and Brandeis. They did have many parallels. They both grew up in the South. They both were born shortly before the Civil War. They both were good Wilsonian progressives, but unlike the New Dealers, they were decentralizers. They believed in resisting centralized power, either financial, economic, or political. And they also understood that centralized financial power and centralized economic power almost always lead to more centralized political power and vice versa. So they did not support the New Deal centralization of government power. Interestingly, Brandeis was involved in two of the major decisions that struck down parts of the New Deal. Glass, as Matt has pointed out, was probably the most outspoken congressional opponent of the New Deal on the Democratic side. He gave a very noted radio broadcast speech against the court packing plan. But they also didn't support, in fact, very much strongly opposed centralized financial power, and that does tend to tie together the experience of the Pujo Committee in 1913 and the Glass-Stegall Act of 1933. That they both were deeply distrustful of Wall Street. I think as citizens of the South and essentially small, mid-sized cities, they were very aware of Wall Street's economic financial power. They were aware how Wall Street could pull money through the correspondent banking system and with the assistance of the Federal Reserve from all different parts of the country and put it into speculative purposes on Wall Street. They understood that very well, and they thought that was destructive of the development of the whole country and ultimately destructive of the financial stability of the whole country, because there had been a series of economic and financial panics leading up to the 1907 panic, ever since the Civil War. Many causes for it, but a lot of them tended to end up somehow connected to Wall Street and security speculation. I've read Dr. Benston's book. He's no longer with us, so my criticisms will be brief, but I think he overstated the claims against Glass-Stegall as much as he claimed that the supporters of Glass-Stegall understated the case for Glass-Stegall. I mean, the fact is that you had massive speculation on Wall Street in the 1920s. You had massive speculation in foreign bonds that were extremely hazardous. You had massive speculation in corporate bonds and corporate securities that were extremely hazardous. The banks, through their securities affiliates, National City was the biggest one, Chase was the second biggest, but there were many others. They used those securities affiliates to promote the sale of those securities around the country to unsophisticated investors, to small banks, to small insurance companies. Those small banks and small insurance companies were blown apart when the crash happened. And Glass and his compatriots knew exactly, because they had people telling them, Wall Street sold us these securities and they destroyed us. And there's lots in the record about how that happened. It is an abundant record. Yes, there are people who have attacked it, but in my view, the record is abundant. That there was plenty of securities speculation that was very destructive, and the Wall Street securities affiliates were a key part of it. Were the securities broker-dealers also part of it? Yes, they were. One pushed the other to greater extremes. Let's jump forward a minute. Okay, so after Glass-Stegall, we basically had a very stable financial system until about 1980, and then the Glass-Stegall Act began to be picked apart by regulators, as has been said here, and eventually, after being picked apart by regulators for about 20 years, Congress essentially repealed it. Now, that was a ratification, but it was far more than a ratification. It gave legal certainty to the repeal of Glass-Stegall. It also gave 100% repeal. The regulators had never been able to repeal more than about 25 to 30% of Glass-Stegall. What Congress did in 1999 was to blow the rest of it apart. What happened after that? Okay, well, pretty soon we had another massive speculative episode where very risky real estate loans were packaged into RMBS, residential mortgage-backed securities, and collateralized debt obligations. Those were spread around not only the country, but the world. Who were they spread around by? The big integrated banks with their securities operations. Yes, they were competing with the big securities firms. Once again, the banks and the securities firms pushed each other to ever greater excesses. That episode of speculation and the promotion of hazardous securities was just as bad, I think worse, than the 1920s. The result was equally disastrous. I think people will tell you that correlation is not causation. But it is very interesting to me that the two times when banks became deeply involved in the securities markets, the 1920s through the securities affiliates and in the 2000s after the repeal of Glass-Stegall, those produced the biggest boom and bust cycles, the most destructive speculative episodes, and the greatest economic disasters that this country has experienced, at least since 1907. And I think both were worse than 1907. So is correlation causation? In my opinion, it's more than correlation. It's more than coincidence. And I think that the feeling that should we risk another episode of the same, I think is worth asking, because we now see new buildups of risky debt, particularly on the corporate side, the household side. We're starting to see risky debt, particularly in things like automobile loans. CDOs are coming back. Subprime mortgages are starting to come back. I'm not sure that we've learned the lesson that Glass tried to teach us. He was very concerned about conflicts of interest within the banking system because the banks giving investment advice and banks giving loans, that's the two of the most important things they can do. But if the bank is lending to support a securities venture, it is no longer an objective lender. It's lending to support another venture that is trying to push. If the bank is trying to encourage its customers to buy securities that the bank has underwritten, it's no longer an objective advisor. For Glass, that was contrary to what he thought were sound banking principles. He also thought it was very dangerous for banks that had this unique access to depositors' funds, which is the cheapest money one can get on the private market. Look at what your bank pays you: 0.1%, 0.2 if you're lucky. That's the cheapest money that you can get in the private market. That money being used to go into speculative securities operations is a very great temptation to the banks, and it's a very dangerous temptation. Glass certainly thought that deposits should not be used for speculative purposes. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in the Glass-Stegall Act and in Glass's warnings about what he observed that I think we can learn from and should revisit. Maybe because I grew up in a small town also, I certainly see the wisdom of Brandeis and Glass, who thought that all wisdom was not centered in Washington and New York, and that it was desirable to spread some of that wisdom around the country and encourage the spread of the wisdom around the country. So again, Matt, congratulations on writing a truly excellent and timely book, and I certainly learned a lot from reading it. Thank you.
So, I didn't know we were going to relitigate Glass-Steagall here again. So,
You might have guessed.
so Matt, can you put on your best Carter Glass carnation and split the baby between these two? How do we fix
Well, the best
this?
talk I ever heard, I spent, like a lot of people in this room, 20 years of my life as an advocate and to preserve Glass-Steagall, but I try to stay neutral in the book, and I hope I did. Mm-hmm. But I think the best talk I ever heard was from a lawyer who had just joined the staff of the House Banking Committee. I have no idea of her name, but she said she talked at the Exchequer Club, and she said that she had been assigned to work on Glass-Steagall. She'd been doing it for 6 months. She did not know much about economics or politics or banking, but she didn't have to because she was from a religious family, Christian Reform from Michigan, Dutch Reform, and she recognized the Glass-Steagall issue as a religious issue. And she named the 7 attributes, only 2 of which I remember. One is that no fact will change anybody's mind. The belief Glass-Steagall is holy writ or it's the devil, and no fact will change anybody. Second, anybody who disagrees with you is going to hell. There's no, and I don't. She had 5 like that. She said she recognized. So I am currently agnostic.
Those two
I am currently agnostic on the issue, and there is no way to split the baby. And I think people look at the same evidence and start with a visceral approach.
So, other things. The more they change, the more they stay the same. So, Carter Glass. You know, he birthed the Federal Reserve System in 1913. It was decentralized. Marino Eccles comes around, and Roosevelt wants him to be the chairman, and he says, I'm not going to do it unless you basically change the whole structure and give me a lot more power. Roosevelt has his people go along with it. Carter Glass isn't very happy about it, intervenes at the last minute, changes it back a little bit, keeps a little bit of the decentralization in it. There was a big debate, does Washington run this, or do the bankers in the country, across the country, still have a say? And that,
I think it shifted the balance over. Let's say before it was 70-30, the Reserve Bank's 30. Yeah. It shifted it 70-30 the other way, I think.
So the
government, but it didn't totally shift it because I think the Open Market Committee is still 7 people from the Federal Reserve.
But it is.
Go ahead.
But
Go ahead.
Finish the story. The more they change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, sorry.
In 2006, the Congress gave the Federal Reserve a new power to pay interest on bank reserves. Mm-hmm. But they gave that power to the Federal Reserve Board, not the FOMC. Oh. So the FOMC is the meeting committee that's supposed to vote on monetary policy, but the principal instrument of monetary policy is now fully controlled by the Federal Reserve Board. And so the law doesn't kind of agree with what happened. So, and over time, we've also seen arguments that the presidents of the reserve banks ought to come through Washington and be appointed by Congress. You've seen this debate continue on. So, the more things change, the more they stay the same. None of these issues has
one interesting fact is that on open market policy issues, almost no dissents come from the members of the board. There's almost an unwritten rule that if you're on the Federal Reserve Board, you don't dissent from what your chairman or chairwoman wants. But the dissents will come from the regional bank presidents.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me the regional bank presidents have been willing to dissent when the board will not. And I think that's a healthy thing.
It is a healthy thing.
I have a
think, too.
third one for you. If we're talking
Go
about,
ahead.
we talked about Glass-Stegall and Federal Reserve Act, independence of the Fed. What would Glass think of a president who wants to name Kane and Steve Moore? Actually, Glass had his own dirty hands in this. Glass wanted the Fed to be independent, but remember, originally it was going to be 5 members plus the controller of the currency and the Secretary of Treasury. Yeah. When Glass was Secretary of the Treasury in 1919, he used his position there to lean on the Fed to sell government war bonds. So Glass actually violated this idea, and I guess where I come out is, and a bunch of presidents have leaned on Federal Reserve.
Absolutely.
So I think the idea that Trump is way off the reservation is wrong. His style may be cruder, he may be more exaggerated, but the Fed is not some holy institution immune from politics.
It's a creature of politics.
Creature of politics.
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up to the audience. Hopefully they'll have some questions for you. And please raise your hand and tell us your name and wait for the microphone. And we have some questions here, right here.
Hi, my name is Mark Nadell, and once upon a time I used to write about regulatory policies. But when we think about regulation, we often talk about costs and benefits. We in terms of Glass-Stegall, we abundantly know about the allegations of the costs of abolishing it to financial crises, maybe caused by that, maybe not. What I'm having trouble understanding is what is the benefit of getting rid of Glass-Stegall? The usual argument is that, well, we get rid of it, we lead to innovation, but I'm squarely in the camp of, I think it was either Warren Buffett or Paul Volcker who said the only useful innovation that banks have ever created is the ATM. So, I mean, mortgage-backed securities is at the very least, a mixed bag. So I would ask the gentleman from the Bankers Association, what exactly, other than Jamie Dimon's bonus, what is the benefit of getting rid of Glass-Stegall?
Well, I'll make 2 comments, and thank you for asking that question. First of all, banks have been involved in a lot of innovation. You find it in the payment system. A lot of things you never see in the payment system that makes it work so well and efficiently is because things that the banks have done and things that they have been doing for numbers of times. You take the checkbook, that was created by state banks. You got credit cards, those are created by national banks, and so forth, all other sorts of payments things. With regard to keep in mind, all that was repealed from Glass-Stegall was the ban on banks affiliating with securities and insurance firms. What that allowed is to eliminate inefficiencies in the financial markets, and it's allowed the financial markets of the United States for now on 20 years to provide a wider range of financial services to people throughout the United States, of all types of financial services, and made them much more competitive. And it broke down up until that point. If you look back, and I remember when I was working in the Senate Banking Committee in the 90s, there was a tremendous concentration of power, if you will, in the securities markets. There were just a very small handful of very large securities firms. When the banks got involved with that, and they got involved bit by bit as the Federal Reserve and the comptroller gave them more and more involvement, you had much more competition. So the cost of being involved in the securities markets has gone down dramatically. I remember when it was, you couldn't price below a nickel or something on your securities. I bought a security the other day. The price was 0.00013 per share. I can't even tell you what that is, but the efficiency of that is tremendous.
Another question. Why don't we take you and then you? Yeah, please tell us who you are and try to keep the question brief.
My name's Mark Lackritz. I'm an adjunct professor of finance at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. My question to the panel was, there seemed to be some consensus that speculation is bad, 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 bad. But risk-taking, obviously, is at the core of capitalism and entrepreneurialism. And it seemed to me that as I was reflecting on it, that your definitions of speculation were that when people are taking too much risk with too much leverage, so that it was really leverage that was distinguishing risk-taking from speculation. I guess, are we stuck with just that speculation is when risk-taking doesn't work out and bad things happen? And that's why we call it speculation, because it seemed to me that you can't have, creative destruction without risk-taking, which occasionally it is another form of speculation.
I mean, my view is that, is the risk-taking being done by the private sector, or is it being done by piggybacking off the federal safety net? So for me, banks take, again, deposits. Those are FDIC insured, and effectively we proved in the last two crises, the savings and loan crisis and the last one, that essentially deposits are going to get paid off 100 cents in the dollar. The people are not going to lose their deposits. So effectively there's 100% deposit insurance. Again, look at what banks pay you for that money, 0.1, 0.2% on short-term deposits. So that's federally insured, federally backed money. To me, to put that money into the securities markets or into the capitals markets is fundamentally to sort of say, heads I win, tails, the taxpayers lose. So yeah. So but see, my view is that that loans are a different thing, because loans are these are long-term investments. These are not short-term bet the movement of the market. And I think banks are good at making loans. Should they be regulated in making loans? Absolutely. But I think the capital market should be over here. That's what Glass-Stegall understood. Capital market should be over here, which is not the long-term lending to people who can't get to the capital markets. Small businesses can't go to the capital markets and get money.
But yeah, that maybe should, but hasn't technology and money markets, hasn't that just obliterated all the distinctions between capital markets, banking, investment?
We've allowed that to be obliterated. I think that brought us the last crisis. I think it will bring us the next one unless we reconsider the virtues of that distinction. I agree that the under current system, the banks and the financial markets are completely integrated, and there is no distinction. I think that's a dangerous move, but I know many people disagree with me on that.
The riskiest thing that a bank does is make a loan. Do you know of any banks that failed because of their securities position? That was one of the things that Benston went and
Citigroup would have failed. Wachovia would have failed.
That's not true. And if you
yes, they would have.
It's not true. And if you look at the history, Benston went and looked at how many banks during the Depression
RBS failed, UBS failed, right.
May I
These
speak?
are all securities issues.
May I speak now, Professor?
No, okay.
Thank you.
You said there weren't any. I'm just saying.
You go back and look at the actual history. Banks during the Depression did not fail because of the securities position. They failed because of loans. Why did banks fail in the last recession? 400 or so of them. It was because of their lending position. It wasn't because of their securities position. Which were the banks that were in the strongest position to rescue the failing institutions? Those were the diversified banks that had a variety of different activities in which they were involved. Citigroup
was insolvent. It was insolvent, and Wachovia was insolvent.
That's an opinion, but the facts don't show that. The facts don't show that.
The thing about Citibank is we had a book event here not too long ago. They've been insolvent 4 or 5 times in history. It probably will be 4 or 5 times more before it's all over. But anyway, another question. So here, please, Isaac, right there.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, Mr. Fink, for this book. I think it would be a perfect couplet to Ahmed's book, The Lords of Finance, about how central banking caused the Depression. And Carter Glass is certainly a player in all of this. I'm John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. My question is simple. You brought up, Mr. Fink, the president's attempt to appoint the politically simpatico Herman Cain and Stephen Moore to the Fed. Would Glass have felt that something like this was just a part of history, and did he have a lot of comments on similar appointments through the year? Wilson having William Gibbs McAdoo on the Fed while Treasury Secretary, FDR naming Gene Meyer, Katharine Graham's dad, to the Fed. What did he say about these things?
I don't recall ever reading any comment Glass made, maybe I'm wrong, about any appointments to the Fed, but as a politician, he would be less surprised than the echo we hear in Washington of an awful, unprecedented thing Trump is thinking about.
He was no fan of Mariner Eccles.
No, he didn't like Eccles, that's true. Yeah, he and Eccles were big enemies. Enemies. Yeah. But that was Eccles' policies. I mean, Eccles was running the Fed. But again, other presidents have been involved. Glass himself, when he was ex officio on the Fed, tried to get the Fed to do things that had nothing to do with monetary policy. So I think he wouldn't like it, but he'd be more understanding of it.
One of the provisions of the Federal Reserve Act that's in the law that is often just barely obeyed, and that is the requirement that you can't have more than one person from the same Federal Reserve district. If you look at the current members of the Federal Reserve, there's quite interesting creativity as to how they say that they're from one particular district or another. I recall one, he went to college there back 20 years or 30 years ago. So, well, then he's from that particular district. But the idea was to try to make sure you genuinely had people from all around the country.
And the argument that, they were too political, or too sympathetic with the Trump's view, and they really weren't qualified, is really kind of crazy. There is no qualification in the law to be a Federal Reserve Board governor, and the only qualification is really politics. You have to be liked enough by the president that he nominates you, and liked enough by the Senate that they will approve you, and that's nothing but politics. So the only qualification to be a Federal Reserve Board governor is to be politically connected, really, and those arguments are just...
I think for some reason there are a lot of cults in this town, but the strongest cult is the Fed, where they even, ex-Fed people refer to it as the temple. Right. And those people all put on their pants the same way we do. Right. And I'll tell you one quick Volcker story, show you who I thought was the greatest public servant I've ever met. Question is, the Fed in the 70s was debating whether they should impose reserve requirements on money market funds. Right. And they had reserve requirements on checking accounts, the Fed, because they're transaction accounts, not on savings accounts, because they don't turn over. There had been 2 Fed Reserve Bank studies that showed money market funds were acting like savings accounts, not checking accounts. People were not transacting very much with them. And I went to see Volcker with that. And he said, I don't care, my wife is a bookkeeper for a small company in New York, and she pays the payroll by writing checks on the Dreyfus Money Market Fund. Right. So here, Mr. Great Genius was basing national policy on his wife's occupation. I mean, it was kind of amazing.
First-hand evidence.
Good evidence, yeah.
One more question. How about, why don't we go right there, please? Kappa, Alpha, whatever.
Good evening. This is an excellent panel. It's hilarious. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. I also served as the Associate Director of the Office of Presidential Correspondence in 2011 at the White House. And I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, but I really want to know. In the 60s, President Kennedy, in regards to the Federal Reserve, what did he try to do? What could or should he have done? And could you just talk about his presidency in relation to the Federal Reserve? Thanks.
I have no knowledge on that.
You've got me before. That even is young for me. I was watching cartoons on Saturday.
The governor was William McChesley Martin.
It gets much more interesting with Lyndon Johnson, because then inflation starts going, and so Lyndon Johnson's relationship with Martin.
McChesley Martin had a colorful career as a Federal Reserve.
That becomes very interesting, right?
Truman appointed him. He was in the Treasury, and he helped Truman negotiate the Federal Reserve Treasury Accord. And Truman nominated him as governor of the Fed. And very quickly, McChesley Martin started doing things that Truman didn't want, raising interest rates. And Truman was very angry about it. And Truman was later, the story is he met him on the street once and said that was the worst decision I ever made, was to appoint you chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
But McChesney Martin was there. He was the one that coined the sort of phrase that the Fed's job is to take the punch bowl away from the party just as it starts to get going. That wasn't a Greenspan, that wasn't a Volcker, that was a William McChesney Martin aphorism. I don't recall that Kennedy did a lot, but Lyndon Johnson really, McChesney Martin, I think, actually resisted political talk to lower rates under Kennedy, but Johnson really put the kibosh on him, and Johnson and he were at loggerheads. But I don't think Kennedy was so successful in jawboning McChesney Martin into doing the bidding of the White House. But Johnson, I think, finally got to him in the end.
Right.
That's my recollection. That's a different book and a different topic.
Right.
Thanks for the question. So we got time for a couple more questions. The Mrs. right there, please. We'll get
Thank
to you
you,
next.
M.A. Torbay. What is the panel's opinion or prognosis if one of the 28 that are advocating for doubling or tripling or quadrupling the capital gains tax rate would have on the economy and or the present low unemployment rate? And by the way, Volcker bigot. We're all Volcker bigots.
I would hate to see the capital gains tax rate go up, but that's my personal opinion.
My general view is, and I think most economists will say this, and I'm not an economist, but whatever you tax, you get less of. So if you're going to tax capital more, you're going to get less capital return, you're going to get less capital investment, and if you get less of that in the end, sooner or later, it's going to affect productivity.
Yeah,
and
I
if
agree.
productivity is eroded, then really the growth in your economy becomes eroded.
But let's get back on topic, a little closer to
Okay.
the topic. So right there, please.
You made a terrific presentation. Question, you focus on Carter Glass, but you don't mention Stegall and what was going on in the House at all. The question for me is, Mr. Abernathy says that there was no data to support this separation. How did they sell it in the House if there was no data? What were they operating on? And how did they go along with what Carter Glass wanted to do?
I think they were concentrated on the FDIC insurance. That's where they were getting their constituents, and they did no heavy lifting on the Glass's separation or Glass's other policies. Stegall was just a guy, happened to be there, was chairman, was not a particularly expert. So I don't think they focused. They just took what Glass had done.
But they fully agreed. I mean,
They agreed with it.
You can find similar speeches in the House where they
agreed
thought
with
that.
There was a lot of public PCORA hearings were going on. They were vilifying National City in New York about, this was the same time that the United States Bank failed.
Right,
And
Bank of the United States, yeah.
PCORA picked up on that and blasted National City, who had the biggest securities affiliate in the country, and it's all in your book. You should be
There was
talking
one
about this.
congressman from Connecticut, he gives a speech and he says, I believe in the biblical view that you can't serve two masters. And he says, to restore integrity to banking, we have to get banks out of the securities business. And there's in parents, applause. In other words, that the whole House, applauded that speech, which I think kind of indicates what their state of mind was.
But the whole public had just gone through this horrible banking crisis where many people lost everything they had in a bank, and there was a stock market crash. Normal people can't separate out what's going on, but the public was, they wanted something done. And
a very curious thing at the time was the banking industry did not strongly oppose it because they weren't making any money in their securities affiliates. So they thought if we can get rid of the securities affiliates, that's a price we're willing
Finally,
to pay.
at the beginning, they opposed it.
A couple in particular.
But it's also a
they
big
said if we
bank.
can get rid of that, then that's fine, but it's a price to pay.
It's a big bank, small bank thing too. The big banks, it's always a fight. The banking system is not a monolith. There's the big institutions and the small small institutions have connections to the small towns and the politicians and the baseball teams and the soccer teams, which they didn't have soccer back then, but baseball teams.
Again,
so there's a
baseball.
lot, it's
Baseball
all
and football
politics.
teams.
It's all
If you
politics.
read the
Again, don't remember, Glass was a big figure. I mean, he'd been around, he wrote the Banking Act. So huge deference paid to him in the House as well. I mean, they're all upset, but Glass is the guy driving the train.
But it was the deposit insurance deal. That's what the House wanted. He didn't like it, but look, I'll do your deal if you do my deal.
And
If you read Michael Perino's book, The Hellhound of Wall Street, which is about the Pecora hearings, I mean, it says that Pecora was getting hundreds, thousands of letters from people who'd lost everything, and they had been visited by their national city, security
We got
salesmen.
30 seconds for one more question.
Right.
One more question quickly. Over here, Mike, please. Quickly.
Tom Timberg, the centralization in the board versus the regional banks has had something to do with the internationalization of banking and financial flows. Did Senator Glass even consider that? Was that part of his frame, or did everybody just assume that this was an American system and what was outside?
I think more the former, more the latter. Mm-hmm. I think they were focused on America. There was 1913.
Yep.
I mean, those were, yeah.
So I'm going to have to pull the punch bowl. I'm sorry, we have a hard stop. But thank you very much, Matt. It's a great book. I highly recommend it, and for our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And Matt, you can buy Matt's book. We have a seller out here. There's wine and cheese out there, and I think Matt is willing to autograph your book if you want to get a copy. It's a really, really good book, and it's not expensive either, I don't think. Cheap, yeah. It's good value. Yeah, no, it's